Hey, welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are looking at the story of Daniel, and this is the fifth installment. I'm calling this one the fiery furnace, and we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3. Last week, King Nebuchadnezzar had this recurring dream, and Daniel was able to tell the king his dream and interpret it for him. It was a dream of a large statue made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, and the interpretation is that it was a prophecy of successive kingdoms and ending with the second coming of Christ. King Nebuchadnezzar reacts very favorably to what Daniel told him, and we see in Daniel chapter 2, verse 46, Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal the mystery. So we see that the king honors Daniel's God, and promotes Daniel and his friends is another thing that happens. The chapter ends on a very high note, but that will not last. We're now going to look at a story in chapter 3 that begins with this. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Okay, so the time is sometime after what we read in chapter 2, where that dream happened. We do know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been promoted, and they are going to be play prominently in this story here. In fact, they're the important characters as opposed to Daniel. So it could be maybe as much as 16 years later. There's some scholarly evidence of that. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are no longer boys. Nebuchadnezzar has his slaves build this wooden structure covered in gold. It's probably not a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, but could be of the god Nebo. He was either on a large pedestal or deformed dimensions or something, because just the way the height of this thing, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, is kind of an unusual image of a person. So it was on a plain near the capital where all could see. And archaeologists have found the base of this structure. So enough time seems to have passed since the king had his statue vision, because he apparently forgot the point. It seems the purpose for the image was to help unify the kingdom, so it was political, but it was dealing with worshiping an idol, and not worshiping the Jewish king, the Jewish God. But this thing also, like I say, it was political, but it also had a stronger purpose than like raising a flag is a political thing, or reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. It was also a religious purpose. We're going to read that his subjects must worship it. In that day of polytheism, all the multiple gods, it's just like adding one more thing to worship. So Nebuchadnezzar, though, apparently never read God's word from Exodus chapter 20, verse 3 through 5, which we all must heed. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth, beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So that is the true God speaking there. This is not something Nebuchadnezzar is following. So let's look at the story. What's going on? Verse 2, Nebuchadnezzar then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Now here's where the trouble begins. In verse 4, Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." Okay. When the musical instruments started playing, it was time to worship the image. And what if you disobeyed this command? It says in verse 6, "Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Aha! We're getting to the fiery furnace here a little bit. This is probably a story we all are aware of, the fiery furnace. But that is the punishment for not worshiping this particular object. It will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, in verse 7, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harps, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And now the trouble is raised a notch in verse 8. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the musical instruments," I didn't recite them all again, "must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." But, this is the astrologers, "there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Okay, so we see we have some troublemakers stirring up trouble for Daniel's buddies. Why is Daniel not in there? He's somewhere else. These three have been promoted. They're kind of overseeing the government. Daniel's not part of this. And then verse 13, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" He's given them another chance. "Now when you hear the sound of the musical instruments, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue from my hand?" Then what God will be able to rescue from my hand? So the king is furious. He's probably been happy with the work of the three Hebrews, so he gives them a second chance to worship. He also repeats the threat of death, concludes with that question, then what God will be able to rescue from my hand? For the three men, this was a bow down or burn kind of situation. Another way, conform or suffer the consequences. And we saw in the last chapter that the king is impressed with the Hebrew God, a God who can interpret dreams and predict the future through Daniel. But the king doesn't seem to be grasping the extent of God's power. So therefore that question, what God will be able to rescue from my hand? Now we get to the good part. In beginning in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Wow. They are taking a stand. They are showing utmost courage because they know the consequences. That phrase, "we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter," I would be like saying there's no point in trying to convince you otherwise. They're not going to bow down, are they? They're not going to conform, are they? What does the king think of that? Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. So as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, that should be the end of the story. He'd probably seen deaths by the furnace before. This was only unusual in a couple of ways. One, as we talked about, in his rage, and probably as an example, the fire was much hotter, proof of its effectiveness, witnessing the deaths of the soldiers. Remember, the soldiers who were accompanying them, they died. It was so hot. And then secondly, those being executed were usually stripped of clothing. Another example of the urgency and rage of the king is that he threw them in with their clothing. But we'll see it was also adding to the outcome that they were clothed. So here comes the surprise. We find in Daniel 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." So the 3 were just walking around, not trying to escape. Their ropes were gone, but they weren't hurt. There was a superior being with them. Now, notice Nebuchadnezzar calls him like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar was not familiar with the Son of God, the part of the Trinity, but he wouldn't know about capital S, Son of God. And although Babylon had belief in angels, and he even calls the being that later, there was an angel, we have to take a look at what this is. Yes, it could have been an angel there in the midst of them, but what do you think about the 4th being Christ himself? There's a lot of evidence through Old Testament stories where Christ himself it appears, including with Abraham. Abraham accompanied with 2 angels. 2 angels accompanied Christ to speak with Abraham as an example. Well, here this could be Christ protecting them, or just being in their midst, being with them. Well, in spite of his Nebuchadnezzar's royal authority, and in spite of his physically committing the Hebrews to the furnace, in spite of the intensity of the flames, the 3 were not going to be consumed. There was nothing left for the king to do but to admit defeat. And it's just so wonderful that there is a 4th being there, which I believe is Christ. So we see Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Now, if you look at it closely, Nebuchadnezzar isn't acknowledging this God as his God, but he is saying he's a God superior to his Babylonian gods. He calls him the Most High God. And then so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. Notice Daniel, the writer, is making sure that we see that there are witnesses to this miracle. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So the men were unharmed, and there were a lot of witnesses to the miracle. Interesting addition that they were clothed, and the clothing was not burned up. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own." Aren't these 3 men great, excellent witnesses? Aren't they great examples? They trusted in their God so much that they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. And then Nebuchadnezzar concludes, "Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Well, there's the end of the story. A story that involves Daniel's friends. It involves King Nebuchadnezzar and him coming more of an understanding of God. And the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being a great example and witness and model of faith. Don't you see the faith of the three shining through? Their faith was so deep that they were willing to give their lives. And so deep in their trust that God would protect them. And that's something I would think I would like to do the same. I'm not so sure when I get into a similar situation. I would hope that I have the faith and the courage. I think the biggest takeaway is the example of courage. I also see the faithfulness of our God toward those who make every effort to follow God's will as they go about their lives, just as these three did. He is not a God who would abandon them, and he would not abandon us. He's a God who kept them safe and would keep us safe. And that is a God to love and to honor and to glorify. Well, that's it for this week. We'll take up more on Daniel's story next week. In the meantime, be safe, take care, and may the Lord be with you.